Jonathan Lee Riches Investigates. I am covering the Moscow, Idaho Bryan Kohberger case. Is there a secret grand jury out there, everyone? Is there a secret grand jury? Has a grand jury been convened in the Bryan Kohberger case? I ask that because it seems the prosecution in the Bryan Kohberger case has been acting very fishy lately. Very, very fishy in the way they are handling the Bryan Kohberger case. I say that because Bryan Kohberger's defense has been asking numerous times for discovery in his case. They've asked 3 separate times and now filed a motion to compel, and they're claiming they're not receiving evidence from the prosecution, some exculpatory, and some basic things like body cam footage of Bryan Kohberger's arrest and notes taken from the Moscow PD and interrogation notes when Bryan Kohberger was interrogated by Corporal Brett Payne, the signer of the arrest affidavit. And they haven't received this information, very basic information, which if Bryan Kohberger doesn't receive it could seriously jeopardize his case. But maybe there's a reason, and the prosecution is not acting fishy, and that's because of a grand jury. There could be a secret grand jury right now convened somewhere in Latah County, and the prosecution is presenting evidence to them to indict Bryan Kohberger to avoid that June 26th scheduled preliminary hearing. There's 2 options in Idaho a prosecutor can do. They can have they can go through the preliminary hearing process where they'll lay out a case to the magistrate judge, Megan Marshall, and the defense has an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses that the prosecution brings forward. But the prosecution can bypass all that by having a grand jury that the defense does not have to participate in. They don't even have to know it exists. My thinking and logic on this situation here is Bryan Kohberger's defense has been asking for discovery. The prosecution has not been providing that discovery, maybe because they want to provide that discovery to the grand jury first for evidence to bypass the entire magistrate process. So Bryan Kohberger gets indicted. There is, to avoid the preliminary process, Bryan Kohberger gets indicted, and there is no preliminary hearing. And then from that point forward, once the indictment goes down, then then the prosecution presents the evidence through discovery to Bryan Kohberger's defense. Like in this stage now, the prosecutions might think, we're not going to give up the stuff that we're using to a grand jury to indict him. It's a very good possibility because it does not make sense that the prosecutor would jeopardize sanctions against them or possibly even a case dismissed by withholding discovery evidence to Bryan Kohberger's defense team. It just does not make sense at all to me, and the only logical conclusion I have is a grand jury. Not only, a grand jury seeing this evidence first before Bryan Kohberger gets the defense gets to see the evidence, but also witnesses won't have to testify against Bryan Kohberger at the preliminary hearing. We know that Bryan Kohberger's defense, Richard Battani, signed an affidavit. Defense, what we call PI, and the defense filed he filed an affidavit. The defense with a motion to get Bethany Funk in there. She challenged it under Nevada law, and then they scrapped that. But that's what prosecution does not want: these witnesses coming on the stand now. And with the grand jury, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that at all. So I think that's what's going on here. I really do. I think at any given time, that Bryan Kohberger could get indicted, and this is the route that I'm thinking. But that's why I'm asking you: do you think this is a scenario, or do you think the preliminary hearing is going to happen and there will be no grand jury? They have all the way up to the preliminary hearing, but the signs are showing. I mean, the prosecution, Bryan Kohberger's defense filed 3 supplemental requests for discovery, and the first 2, the prosecution didn't even give most of the stuff that the defense was asking for. Now Ann Taylor filed a motion to compel, and with a grand jury, if it indicts, all that not giving Bryan Kohberger all that discovery is mute at that point, because then you have a grand jury that indicted, and all that magistrate stuff doesn't even happen anymore. It's all mute. I don't even think the gag order at that point could be sufficient if you bypass the entire magistrate court process. The magistrate judge is for arraignment and preliminary hearing and scheduling motions in between. That's it. Once it hits preliminary hearing, goes past that, it goes to a district judge. This is a little bit about the process with the preliminary hearing right here.
This is some information regarding Idaho court rules, preliminary hearings. A preliminary hearing is a hearing to determine if a person charged with a felony should be tried for the crime charged based on the presentation of evidence that he/she committed the crime. A preliminary hearing is held in the lowest local court, magistrate, without a jury, within days of the arraignment. And that's interesting here because with the Bryan Kohberger case, we're talking preliminary hearing is months after the arraignment, not days where that's normally what happens, but only if the prosecutor has filed the charge without asking the grand jury for an indictment. If the judge finds sufficient evidence to try the defendant, the case is sent to the district court for trial. If there's not enough evidence to support the charge, the judge will dismiss the case.
So yeah, could bypass it. Bypass the entire preliminary hearing process. And then I want to tell you a little information under Idaho rules about the grand jury with defendants and evidence.
This is Idaho statutes Title 19 criminal procedure, powers and duties of grand jury. Evidence for defendant. Evidence for defendant, the grand jury is not bound to hear evidence for the defendant, but it is their duty to weigh all the evidence submitted to them. And when they have reason to believe that other evidence within their reach will explain away the charge, they should order such evidence to be produced, and for that purpose may require the prosecuting attorney to issue process for the witnesses. This is in regards to evidence submitted to the grand jury.
I'm just thinking the prosecution is not giving the defense evidence because the prosecution wants to give the evidence to the grand jury first so they can issue an indictment. Do you think differently? I want to know your thoughts on this matter. Subscribe to my channel, hit the notification button. I am covering the Bryan Kohberger case at all angles. If you want in-depth coverage, check me out. And if he does have a preliminary hearing, I will be there, seeing what's going on, going out there and seeing who arrives and who doesn't arrive, and going in there and checking out the proceedings, even if it makes me have to get up at 3 a.m. to get one of those limited spots at the preliminary hearing. They only have like maybe 50 or 60 slots. I want to be in there. I want to see Bryan Kohberger. I want to see his facial features. I want to see what he discussed with his lawyers, whispering, and his body language, and I want to hear what his defense has, and I want to see what the prosecution has. Because right now I am personally a little bit disappointed in how the prosecution is behaving based off this not giving Bryan Kohberger evidence, you know. And then also a risk, you know, the prosecution has also with the preliminary hearing is with the grand jury, the case automatically goes to the district judge, right? Because prosecution does a one-sided case, presents their whatever evidence they want, and they can do as limited evidence as possible because we know that a grand jury indicts a hand sandwich. But they present a case to the grand jury indicts, it bypasses preliminary, goes to district judge. With the preliminary, the prosecution actually risks losing the case because the case could get dismissed. I'm not saying it will, probably won't, because this is just a big case and it's a high-profile case, but it could technically get dismissed, and the prosecutor does not want to risk that and get Bryan Kohberger back on the streets for something. I'm not saying, you know, I don't doubt if it would get dismissed, but you never know. You never know. We'll talk soon. Stay tuned.